There is no letter that shines a brighter historical light on the early church than Paul's letter to the Galatians. It is in this epistle that all becomes clear. And by all, I really mean all. The substance in this letter helps us to draw so many conclusions about the early church and the chronology and historical impetus behind most, if not all, of the writing in the New Testament. Let us remember who Paul was exactly and what his position was in the early church. It was not as secure as one might think. There are 2 points about which the majority seem to agree. The first is that when it comes to who was the first writer of the New Testament, the answer is always St. Paul. And most scholars, atheist and agnostic scholars included, usually believe that it was Paul's letter to the Galatians, or to a lesser extent, the first letter to the Thessalonians, that was written first. The date of Paul's first letter ranges from around 46 AD to the early 50s AD, which puts it within a decade and a half of Jesus' death and resurrection. So for those who say that the Bible isn't true because the stories were written down too long after the fact and have been skewed and changed over time, have clearly done no research into the matter. As I write this, it is 2024, which means that 9/11 happened over 20 years ago. Everyone my age and above remembers every detail of that day like it was yesterday. And if any of us were to write what happened that day and try to skew it somehow, then there would be many who would be able to call us out if we were lying. This is the exact same situation for those that lived through the death and resurrection of Jesus, except a million times more. So no, when these letters were written, the facts had not gotten lost like the message in a long game of telephone, as some skeptics might argue.
The telephone game. You've heard this objection before. You proclaim the Bible is God's inspired, infallible, inerrant, sufficient Word of God. And the student responds, because they probably watched a 30-second YouTube video, hey, the Bible, it's like the game of telephone.
Is the transmission of the Bible like the telephone game?
You know, Bobby, I hear that a lot, and that's what a lot of people think, that it's just gone from person to person to person. And over the course of time, like the telephone game, when you do that, the message at the end is always different than at the beginning. So first of all, the telephone game is designed to cause confusion. You whisper it only one time, and the other person has to try and remember. That's not the way the Bible stories were transmitted. And even in an oral culture, before the Bible was written down, the stories could be transmitted from person to person, but yet in a way that they're rehearsed, they are corrected, they are shaped to make sure that the person got it right. This is the way the Hebrew teachers would teach their schools. And so no, the Bible is not transmitted like the telephone game.
Skeptics frequently argue that the Gospels aren't based on eyewitness accounts. They were composed decades after Jesus' death by people not familiar with first century Israel, and they wrote after hearing stories passed down to them, and those stories came from others who heard those stories. It's just one long game of telephone. So how can we know that we have the actual words of Jesus? Well, one piece of evidence that goes against the telephone game theory is the parables of Jesus. The Gospels present Jesus as a formal teacher or rabbi with disciples. New Testament scholar Peter J. Williams notes that the Gospels use the word disciple or disciples 195 times, and they also describe Jesus as a teacher or a rabbi 62 times. If Jesus was a rabbi in the traditional sense, his students would probably memorize his teaching. Now, think about parables for just a moment. They are very simple and easy to remember, and they have a quality that sticks with you even after hearing them only once. A gifted communicator like Jesus must have understood this, and if he taught for 3 years, he'd likely repeat the same parables, so his disciples could easily pass them on to others without much effort.
So no, When these letters were written, the facts had not gotten lost like the message in a long game of telephone, as some skeptics might argue. And the second point about which the majority seem to agree is that St. Peter was the first leader of the early church, which is why in the Catholic Church, St. Peter is considered the first pope. It is my contention, however, that both conclusions about the early church are wrong. We are overlooking arguably the most important figure in the early church, the real first writer and first leader. Enter St. James the Just, who is described as the Lord's brother in both the New Testament and by the first century Jewish historian Josephus. It was James who was the real first leader of the early church. It was he who gave the final word on the important matters of the day. All one needs to do is turn to Acts 15, 13 through 21 to see that when there was a contention between members over points of faith in the early church, it was James who had the final say. And furthermore, it was the letter of James that was the real first writing of the New Testament. The truth of what I'm saying is evident in the writing itself. But before we get to the substance of the letter of James, we must first address another controversy. The first issue with saying that James was the first writer of the New Testament is that modern scholars argue over the authorship of the letter of James almost more than any other. Perhaps they know that authorial validation of this letter gives the Christians all the power in any debate about testimonial authority. For this reason, most modern scholars believe that the letter was written by an anonymous writer using the name of James to give it credibility. That conclusion, however, is the result of poor scholarship. For you see, the brilliant New Testament scholar John A.T. Robinson lays out a compelling case for James's authorship in his book, Redating the New Testament. It's hard to argue with the points that Robinson makes, the best of which, I believe, is the point that if one were trying to write from James's point of view, which is to say, his place of authority, then one would expect this pseudo-James to use titles like the Lord's brother or Bishop of Jerusalem, which was how James was known in his time, in order to assert his credibility, which is the whole point of using the name James in the first place, if that was, in fact, what some anonymous writer was doing. James, the actual brother of the Lord and actual Bishop of Jerusalem, did not do this or feel the need to because he had nothing to prove, since he was in fact himself. And even more than that, James was extremely pious according to all his contemporaries, including those who opposed him. Thus, the real James was humble and would not feel the need to do what an anonymous pseudo-James would do, or at least be expected to do. To quote Robinson, the argument for pseudonymity is weaker here than with any other of the New Testament epistles. That is quite a confident and bold stance to take, especially for an Anglican bishop who does not shy away from highlighting the doubts that surround other biblical theories he posits. Now that we have established that it was in fact James who was writing the letter of James, how do we know when he was writing? There are a couple of different ways we can tell the timing of the letter. The first is contextual. James is clearly writing to a strictly Jewish audience of believers, which was only true of the early church in the very beginning, because it wasn't long before Gentiles made up most of the church. What is more, the letter of James does not delve into the major components of what makes up the Christian faith, such as the crucifixion and resurrection, as if it was written prior to when those beliefs were fully articulated and established. What James instead focuses on is how his community should understand the Torah in this post-Jesus world. James writes, "What doth it profit, my brethren, though a man say he hath faith and have not works? Can faith save him? Even so, faith, if it hath no works, is dead, being alone." The point James is making here is clear. Faith alone is not enough. One must have both faith and works, which to his Jewish audience meant that they should still adhere to the law of Moses. So how does this help us date the letter of James? The context of James' letter, when placed in conjunction with the context of Paul's writing, will help us better understand the historical timeline of the early church. As I already said, many scholars believe that Paul wrote first, and that his first letter was either the letter to the Galatians or the first letter to the Thessalonians. Nonetheless, according to Robinson's New Testament chronology, the letter of James was written first, and then Paul wrote the first letter to the Thessalonians shortly thereafter. I agree with Robinson about James writing first. I disagree, however, that Thessalonians was Paul's first letter. I subscribe more to Rose Publishing's Bible Overview and its New Testament dating that places Paul's letter to the Galatians as his first letter, which still comes after the letter of James. Others have come to the same conclusion.
I want to share with you the order that I placed Paul's 13 letters, and I'll explain to you why I did so. All right, let's begin with what I believe to be the oldest, number 1, Galatians.
The letter to the Galatians is first. In Acts 13 to 14, Paul and Barnabas went on their first apostolic journey, which took them into Galatia, with cities like Antioch, Lystra, Derbe, etc. Soon after Paul returned from this journey, he wrote the letter to the Galatians. See Galatians 1:6, where Paul writes to the Galatians and says, "You are so quickly turned." Galatians was written soon after Paul returned from that first journey, therefore soon after Acts 14:27. That makes Galatians the earliest of Paul's letters.
Even Robinson himself makes a case for an earlier date for Galatians, despite listing Thessalonians first in his chronology. Based on what we know about the history of the early church, Paul's letter to the Galatians being written shortly after the letter of James seems to make the most historical and contextual sense. I say this because it seems apparent that Paul is writing in direct response to James, in more ways than one. There is no letter that shines a brighter historical light on the early church than Paul's letter to the Galatians. It is in this epistle that all becomes clear, and by all, I really mean all. The substance in this letter helps us to draw so many conclusions about the early church and the chronology and historical impetus behind most, if not all, of the writing in the New Testament. Let us remember who Paul was exactly and what his position was in the early church. It was not as secure as one might think. There were the apostles who actually walked with Jesus, like Peter, John, and Matthew. And there was Jesus' family, James, the Lord's brother, and St. Jude. But Paul, on the other hand, did not walk with Jesus. He was an outsider who claimed that Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus. An appearance, mind you, that occurred as Paul was in the process of persecuting the faithful. Nevertheless, Paul carved out a place for himself in the early church. His revelation contained too much truth to be ignored, and his eloquence with words and his inexplicable depth of spiritual and scriptural understanding caused those closest to Jesus to quickly accept him as one of their own. Paul's letter to the Galatians shows a balancing act between an outsider looking in and an insider looking out. This comes through as Paul explains why he is to be a trusted authority on the teaching of Jesus, despite being an outsider. Paul shared his gospel that he claims to have received directly from Jesus with James, Peter, and John. They agreed with Paul's teaching. Paul says this to show that the gospel he received is truly from God, because even though he never knew the earthly Jesus in the flesh, he apparently knew him well enough that those that really knew Jesus agreed that Paul's teaching was in fact correct, and thus that he was to be as trusted as an apostle. Paul explains, "And when James, Peter, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given unto me, gave to me and Barnabas the right hands of fellowship." What Paul does next, however, is bold and unexpected. After using James and Peter and the right hand of fellowship they offered him to show that he should be a trusted authority, he then turns the tables on them and says they are not to be trusted. What? Exactly. Paul accused Peter of being a hypocrite, acting one way with Paul and the Gentiles, and then acting another way with the Jews that came from James in Jerusalem. Paul writes, "But when Peter came to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed. For before certain men came from James, he did eat with the Gentiles. But when they were come, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision. And the other Jews dissembled likewise with him, insomuch that Barnabas also was carried away with their dissimulation. But when I saw that they walked not uprightly according to the truth of the gospel, I said unto Peter before them all, If thou, being a Jew, livest after the manner of Gentiles, and not as do the Jews, why compellest thou the Gentile to live as do the Jews? We, who are Jews by nature, and not sinners of the Gentiles, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith of Jesus Christ, even we have believed in Jesus Christ, that we might be justified by the faith of Christ, and not by works of the law. For by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified." Paul's letter to the Galatians highlights his direct opposition to James, both literally and figuratively. Literally, in the sense that Paul was literally in Peter's face attacking him for his prejudicial attitude against the Gentiles, an attitude which Paul blamed indirectly on James via the men sent from him. And Paul was figuratively opposed to James in the sense that he seems to be writing this letter in direct opposition to James's letter in the substance thereof, by saying that one is saved by faith alone and not by works. It is easy to tell that the tone of Galatians is one in response to something else, and that something else is clearly James, who had written in his letter that one was saved by faith and works. So let us recap where we are now in terms of chronology. If Galatians is considered by many to be Paul's first letter, and the substance of that letter seems to be a response to the letter of James, then that would confirm for us that James did indeed write first. So, we have James, the first leader of the early church, as we saw in Acts 15. And the first writer of the New Testament, as we just logically deduced from Paul's responsive first letter. And you have Peter, the second leader of the early church, who seems to be the go-between, or, for our purposes, the middle ground or middleman between James and Paul. And last, you have Paul, an outsider who never met Christ in the flesh, but who understands Christ as deeply as any of those who have. The only difference is Paul's uncanny ability to articulate it, which has granted him apostolic access. In Galatians 2:7, Paul explains his role in the early church. Peter is to preach the gospel to the Jews, and Paul is to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. This division of labor, which is to say, these two different gospels, leads us directly into the greatest literary enigma the world has ever known. It is referred to in academic circles as the synoptic problem. It is the riddle of all riddles. It is the seemingly impossible task of trying to unravel the mystery of the synoptic gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These three gospels share so much in common, using similar order and near mirror language, which tells us that someone is copying someone else. But who? Was Luke copying Matthew? Did Matthew and Luke copy Mark? Did Mark copy Luke or Matthew? Who wrote first? Who wrote second? And who wrote third? The ramifications of each possible conclusion are more consequential to our understanding of the truthfulness of Scripture than I can explain here. If you'd like to see more about this topic, stay tuned for part 2.